Alright, peace and greetings, YouTubers. When I tell you I am tired of black people being collateral to the punitive entitlement of white folks, and what I mean by that is this. You have a pocket of white folks in this country who feel some kind of way because they have to exist amongst everybody else. And within that existing amongst everybody else, they have to share the same resources. And even though they still receive the majority of the benefits, the privileges, and everything that makes life so great and so dandy, they still feel like they have lost something because just by other people having a fraction of what they have, it's still too much. And so they get into these pockets where they feel that their world is ending, and they jump into these random thought points about white erasure, and they look at declining birth rates. And rather than attributing declining birth rates to the fact that the United States stopped investing in its people, it stopped investing in things like housing, education, healthcare, jobs, fair wages, things that make people want to procreate and be in a space where they know that their offspring will be okay if they bring people into this world. They want to look at it as the country's getting browner, the white majority is going down, we're losing everything, we're losing our politics, we're losing our free speech, so on and so forth. And then comes the rage, then comes the violence, then comes everybody to blame, but the very institutions that they created that pretty much caved in on themselves. Instead of blaming that, they want to blame everybody else. And so in Buffalo, it was black folks. And again, black folks continue to be collateral to white rage, white anger, white fear, white choices, their foolery, the inferiority complexes that exist. And again, punitive entitlement. When I say punitive entitlement, I'm speaking about the fact that when people don't get their way, they want everybody else to suffer because they feel that if they can't have something, nobody should even have the right to even live. That's what you're seeing right now. And one thing I don't want to hear, because I've already seen it in the media, they're starting the conversations about mental health. And what happened in Buffalo is not a mental health issue. Let's clear that up right now. Because first of all, you have this 18-year-old who spent all their time on message boards and forums where, again, the content that pretty much was centered on those forums is all rooted in anti-blackness, white nationalism, neo-Nazism, all the things, all the isms that are out there. And so he spent all his time on those websites, right? You know, he has this whole manifesto he's written about what's happened, and again, the erasure of white people and all these different groups he has smoke for. And then he live streams himself going and shooting everybody in the grocery store. Mind you, he drives 3.5 hours to go and do this. Goes 200 miles out of the way to go and randomly shoot some people in the grocery store that were minding their business. In this modern day and age where the food is already expensive, there's no baby formula, people got to spend $5.50 for a gallon of gas. Everybody is struggling and going through all kinds of different things, but for some reason, his alleged struggle that he's created in his head is more important than everybody else's, and he decided that people needed to die. So he goes and he shoots 13 people, 11 of which were black. And so that is not anything in regards to a mental health conversation. That is intentional. That is privilege being challenged. And when the privilege gets challenged, here comes white rage. That's what that's about. And so they can stop trying to have this conversation about mental health, because they always do that to try to coddle and protect these white aggressors that go and, again, terrorize people all around the world. And we've seen this happen before. We saw what happened with the Charleston 9, where you literally have an individual who goes to a black church and specifically targets a black church, a black congregation, sits in Bible study with them. These people have prayed, they've sang, they've fellowshiped, they welcomed him in with open arms and grace. They probably even had fish plates for him. And what did he decide? Even after sitting amongst them for more than an hour, they still gotta die. That's the chaos that we're living under, and it's becoming something that's normalized and almost celebrated because, again, when you have white rage and white fear and racism and anti-blackness all mixed in together with the conversation of privilege being challenged, anything goes because, again, people are going to fight and claw to maintain that status quo that once existed. And so we're living in a space where now other groups of people have decided to celebrate themselves in the same way that they've always had to celebrate whiteness. Because again, for years, this country has operated as a place where whiteness was always the standard. And in reality, it still is. It's still backed by policy. It's backed by law. It's even backed by our culture. It's backed by literally everything we do in this country. But you have groups of people who are now trying to combat that, who are trying to seam rip those ideologies and celebrate themselves and empower themselves. And just that little bit of empowerment is too much for some folks. It makes them uncomfortable. And again, now people got to go. You're going to have to go do something and handle things. And so that's why somebody like a Kyle Rittenhouse is celebrated. You know, that's where we're at, where again, you're starting to see the rise of white nationalism, where again, it's always been here, but people are more open about it. They don't have to hide it anymore. In the past, when you had things like the Klan, you know, they had to keep the hoods on and do whatever they did because these were doctors and teachers and engineers and people that worked at the gas station, and so they still wanted to have their livelihood, so they would do all the shenanigans behind closed doors. Or like the skinheads and some of these other groups, they go meet out way in the woods. And now we're in this space where these groups will meet out in public. They don't care because, again, now these conversations and viewpoints are being embraced. from a public standpoint, to the point where people can say all kind of crazy things and have these very extreme viewpoints, and they can get elected to office. You know, they get big platforms, they get news shows, they get podcasts, they get all these things, and advertisers will invest in them because, again, money talks. And hey, even if the advertisers don't like what's being put out there, if it's bringing in money, if it's affecting the bottom line and it's bringing in some major revenue, they will endorse it and allow it to happen. And so now you're seeing the rise of pretty much, again, anti-blackness through the lens of white nationalism. And in addition to that, other groups suffer as collateral as well, because again, if things can happen towards black people, the next other groups of people are next in line. And so you're seeing the nonsense that's taking place. And what I've always just found so interesting in all of this, you know, when I saw the bit about the white erasure, I said, white erasure, huh? And, you know, because I'm looking and I'm like, you know, y'all will talk about white erasure, and, you know, sometimes you'll see those clips where somebody does something racist in a grocery store, right? You know, they go and bother somebody else of another race, and then another white person comes and checks them, and then that person gets mad because the white person checked them, and so they start saying things like, you know, you're the reason we're losing the country. You're the reason why the country is going down. Because, again, they're mad at that other white person because that white person is not playing the role. They recognize that there's a status quo and a system that has always been there, and so by that random white person deciding to go and take the back and support whatever person is being pretty much, you know, terrorized, all of a sudden the other person is pissed off because they're not playing their role. That's kind of like what we're talking about. But when you see that conversation of white erasure, it's so interesting that they'll rant about culturally being erased and so on and so forth, but they have no problem gentrifying every metropolitan city in this country. Where, again, literally every metropolitan city right now is being gentrified, where black neighborhoods are being erased. The cultural significance of the establishments that were created by black communities are all being erased and being franchised and turned into yoga gyms and Starbucks. And again, you hear no conversation about that because they're perfectly fine doing that to other people. But the minute somebody's culture is not fully embraced and seen as a standard anymore, now they think they've lost something. They think they've lost something because they have to share resources with folks. But in reality, like I've said before, the policy, the law, everything is still there to ensure that white people are going to be okay at the expense of everybody else. And that's how this country has always been. This country is rooted in anti-blackness, and that's pretty much what has funded our economy. And again, when you're talking about slavery and sharecropping, the Nadir period, the convict leasing, Jim Crow, all these different things that took place to ensure that money could still circulate on the backs of black people and ensure that other groups of people, specifically white Americans, would always be okay. Like, that is the lineage and history of the United States, and still is. The policies have never really changed, okay? And so when they constantly say that they're losing things, I'm like, when I'm looking at it on a macro scale, there's not this rollout of public policy and amendments and ordinance and covenants and everything else to ensure that white people are disenfranchised. Absolutely not. White people have never been oppressed in their own country. They've never been oppressed structurally in this country because, again, this country is built to ensure that they will be okay at the expense of everybody else. But like I said, because we now have the emergence of things like social media, and they now see how some people honestly feel about their viewpoints and how they operate, they feel attacked. And because they're used to constantly being, you know, the top tier everything, red carpet rollout, everybody must walk on eggshells to ensure that they are comfortable all the time. Now that people are calling them out on their nonsense, they feel that they've lost everything. And so here comes the violence. Here comes all the different crazy talking points. And again, it goes back to our politics. Here come all of the very extreme politicians that have gotten put into office, where people can run without even having a real platform. They just have to latch on to some anti-black talking points, do some fear-mongering, make some people the boogeyman, and you get in. Oh, and just make sure you have a gun in your political ad. You know, shoot a truck or something and say nobody's going to take my gun. You know what I mean? Pull like a Brian Kemp, where you run with no platform and you just shoot a truck and say, I'm Brian Kemp, I like my gun, and nobody's going to take it, and you get to be the governor of Georgia. Or you can pull like a Lauren Boebert and you just walk around with a gun in your little political ad and say, I'm going to go shake up things in Washington, but you don't come with any policy. Because again, you can put the fear in everybody, and really it's not fear, it's just anti-blackness and the fear of change, the fear of having to exist in the same space with other groups of people. And yeah, you can get people to back you. So now we're in a space where you're watching these I call them extremist politicians, come into power and get elected with no platforms, literally just latching on to white anger and using it as their platform to get elected into office. And again, when we talk about the United States, all of the branches of government are rooted in anti-blackness. All right, you're seeing it in the House and the Senate, the executive branch. It's all over it. It's all up and through there. It doesn't matter who's in office. And then even again, when you're talking about the judicial branch and the Supreme Court, and just when you're looking at the laws that are being put into play, one of the things I wish I would have kept in my last In the News video, but I took it out because I was like, okay, maybe you're shaking the table too much. But again, going back to that conversation about declining birth rates, especially amongst white folks, it's interesting that all of a sudden now abortion is something that people want to ban. Let's put some pieces together. You know what I mean? And so when they start talking about this erasure that exists. I'm just like, interesting, because then, even then, when we talk about the conversation of collateral, the fact that this individual could go and specifically pick out a black neighborhood to go to and shoot up a grocery store in an area where the neighborhood is 80% black goes back to redlining. Again, black people being collateral to the decisions of white folks. Redlining where, again, the United States is drawn out and created in a space where black folks are concentrated in specific areas because they're not allowed to live anywhere else. And so we fast forward 30, 40, 50, 60 years. Now we have a landscape in 2022 where, again, you still have pockets of black people that are concentrated together based on the layout of how America was laid out. Because, again, when we talk about the FHA and how black people were not allowed to receive mortgage loans and everything else like that for properties outside of the red zones because, again, they weren't allowed to live in the blue, green, or the yellow areas. Here we are in 2022. Even when we're minding our own business, things that happened in the past still affect us today, when in reality we're just existing and minding our business. That's the kind of nonsense I'm talking about. Or even the fact that literally every major freeway in this country has some kind of correlation to destroying a black neighborhood in order to be constructed because white people needed to be comfortable traveling to where they were going. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. So when they start talking about all this erasure and whatever's happening, it's more like you need to actually read a book and check into history what's really happening. Again, when you're coddled your whole life and told you're the best at everything, and then history shows otherwise, people get pissed off. That's what that's really about. And so it's just interesting because, like I said, you've seen the emergence of people like Tucker Carlson and all these people that have these very extreme talking points. And again, somebody like Tucker Carlson is probably the highest rated news anchor in the country right now. You know what I mean? And so you talk on these different speaking points and people will endorse it, and look what it stirs up. It stirs up these different conversations and these different elements of emotions within specifically white men because, again, you can be very impressionable when you have a platform that's backed by millions of dollars. You can say any and everything and pass it off as truth, and people will jump right in line behind you and want to support whatever it is that you're pushing. And so, of course, they have signals and different codes that they always put out there without directly saying, go and do this and go and do that. But people know exactly what's happening. People aren't stupid. And so here we are. You're just seeing all of the nonsense. And so it's just like, all right. And so funny though, because again, they'll sit here and have these random rants about, oh, our freedom of speech is being attacked because when we say racist things, people don't like it and they feel some kind of way about us. But again, you're seeing the movements where they're trying to, look, the CRT backlash, where things that are not even taught in K through 12 curriculums all of a sudden are under attack. And so now we're in a space where kids aren't allowed to learn about Ruby Bridges because it will make white folks feel bad. And I'm just like, interesting. We're at a place where you look at the state of Virginia, there's a hotline for parents to call if they feel that a teacher is teaching CRT. And we know good and well that that hotline is specifically something that benefits white folks, not anybody else, because why would it be a problem for anybody else to learn about history? You know what I mean? And so we're just in a space where voting rights are on the chopping block. You know what I mean? So there's all these things that are affecting black people collectively and other groups of people that are not working against white people because, like I've said, there is no rollout of policy that disenfranchises white people on a macro scale. Never has been, because that would disrupt the flow of this country in regards to the status quo. And so it's interesting that, they have latched onto these viewpoints of things that they've almost created in their heads to try to make a whole argument about and start a whole movement. And it's crazy because people jump behind the movements that take place. And so again, right now what you're seeing is people are pissed because the level of comfort in regards to their mediocrity is being challenged. They're afraid that they're going to have to do things like everybody else and they don't want to because everything has been rolled out to them in the past. And the fact that this guy was 18, you haven't even lived yet. And you've already made the decision that, things are just so out of pocket, I need to go and kill some people because, again, they want to be martyrs, they want to be heroes. Because, again, this country is so anti-black that when people go and do these racially or pretty much racist attacks, they're celebrated by people in the white collective and people donate to their defense funds. That's how George Zimmerman got all that money after he killed Trayvon Martin. Because again, even though he's Latino or whatever, we recognize Latino is not technically a race, it's an ethnicity, and he still aligns with white nationalism. He still aligns through a white lens, and so people saw him as an agent of whiteness and still celebrated him. And so yeah, he's deemed as a hero, Trayvon Martin is deemed as a thug, and for some reason, his death is justifiable. And we've seen that with so many other people. And so again, there's so many crazy things that are taking place. And one of the things I find so interesting in all of this is that there was no intel that was out there to pretty much stop this from happening. In this modern era of technology where, you got all of the technology that these different investigators and stuff use to track down and stop different terrorist attacks and everything else, for some reason they had no intel. Because it's so interesting that as soon as this took place, the news media had all the details on this guy, and he was a this, he was a that, he was a that. I'm like, how'd y'all get all that so fast? So clearly somebody must have knew something, but nobody said anything. Because what's interesting for me is when we go to the peak of COINTELPRO, you go to the 60s and the 70s, the FBI and all of them did not have the same kind of technology. The internet was not really a thing like that yet. There were no forums and internet clouds and all these things and cell phone data to trace and collect information on people, but somehow they were able to successfully, literally infiltrate every black movement and keep tabs on every public black figure that challenged the status quo without the help of the internet. All they literally had was tapping phone lines and word of mouth. And you mean to tell me in 2022, with all of the evidence that this individual had out there, the different posts that were posted on all these forums, the fact that he was able to go on Twitch and live stream what he was getting ready to do and still drive 3.5 hours and there was no kind of tip off with anything? Interesting. And so, you know, condolences to the families that are affected, but it's just like, man, folks is irritating. You know what I mean? It's just like, It's a headache because it's like you don't even have a solution for the nonsense because there's just so much of it. And like I've said before, there's just never a limit to how low some folks will go, all in the name of whiteness. And like I've said before, I think a lot of the frustration is because I personally feel that the U.S. is on the decline and has been for years. And that's because people in this country decided to not invest in the country. They decided to vote against their interests to ensure that they could stay above somebody else. And so rather than ensuring that infrastructure would be okay, healthcare, education, housing, jobs, food, you know, the natural resources, all of that, rather than ensuring that you put politicians and candidates in power and supported agencies that would make sure that everybody would be okay, they wanted to still have something over everybody else. So a lot of people in white America have voted against their interests for so many decades, to the point where the focus is no longer on the progression of the country. It's all about whose rights can we strip away. It's all about who can we continue to vilify and paint as the enemy, rather than focusing on the fact that if we could all do this and do that, we could make sure that everybody is great. But again, folks want to have one up on everybody, on each other. Folks feel entitled to everything else that they didn't work for. So an entire country that was built off black oppression, there's folks who feel that they deserve all of the revenue and the wealth that came from that. And again, at the expense of everybody else. That's where we're at. So we'll see how everything unfolds. And the fact that he had the nerve to go and plead not guilty, like, you're literally on camera doing it. You live streamed it and went and did it. And then got the guts to go not, like, they're playing in our faces. Because they want to be infamous. They want to be seen as heroes. Listen, I said this when Kyle Rittenhouse got off. I was like, by him getting off, that opened the floodgate for everybody else to come and do the same kind of shenanigans. And that's what you're seeing. Anyway, I'm out. Share your 2 cents. Subscribe.